Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. This is Timothy Belfry, and today I'd like to talk about Cyberpunk Edgerunners. Cyberpunk Edgerunners is great. I loved everything about it. The themes are poignant, the art direction is beautiful, the music's on point, and the voice acting is great. Now, beforehand, I'd just like to say that I have a bit of a bias towards Cyberpunk in general. I love the aesthetic. I love how sleek it is. I love how dark the future is in this series, and I like the contrast between the heavily oppressive regime that Cyberpunk universes are under and then the light-hearted or at least overall hopeful vision of the future that they provide, where even in these dark times there's always a bright and at least relatively happy hope for the future, and I love it. It's fantastic. So let's get into it. Now, as far as the audio goes, for the English dub, it's completely unacceptable. I don't know if it was my internet or anything else, but when I first watched it in the English dub, it was weird. Like the characters just didn't sound how they were designed to, nor was that specifically what they were going for, and it just sounded bad. Whereas with the Japanese audio, it's just way better. Fortunately, I at least think that Netflix defaults to the Japanese audio, so just do that. It's way better. And I know some people complain that, oh, I don't want to be focusing on two things at once because then I have to be reading and then watching the thing at the same time, but trust me, you'll have such a better experience with it because the voice actors in Japanese are so good. They nail those lines so hard, and I can't recommend watching it in the subs enough. Now, as far as how the show looks, it animates really well. It's really pretty at all times. There's no mistakes that I at least saw on a initial look at. So yeah, I'm amazed at what Studio Trigger did with this series. It's fantastic. I like how everything looks. I like how sleek and futuristic yet kind of jaggy it all looks, because for example, with like a modern aesthetic with machines and cars and stuff, everything's so like smooth and boring and terrible, whereas the cyberpunk future, at least I would hope it would be, is nice and sleek, but not like aerodynamic. There's a lot of like edges and everything's all chromed up, and there's a lot of like really shiny lights that are contrasted with completely dark streets or completely depressing tones. It's, oh man, a lot of blues and yellows. Ugh, I love it. Love it, love it, love it, love it, love it. Now, as far as music goes, there's nothing to distract you from what's happening, and it all matches perfectly. There's a lot of tracks that they took from the game, so expect to hear repeats of songs that you've already heard if you've played Cyberpunk 2077, but they're reused well and perfectly fine, and honestly, no issues at all. And there are some new tracks in here too, so if you're looking for more stuff like they have in the games, then you'll find it here. Now, to be fair, I didn't listen to the radio that often in Cyberpunk 2077, so I don't know if that's 100% true, but from what I've played, I think that's accurate. But anyway, yeah, music's good, and it fits, and yeah. I would definitely listen to the soundtrack if it came out. Now, as far as tone goes, I could see some people not liking it. It is very dark. A lot of violence happens on screen, and it's very graphic, but I think it's intended to be specifically not glorifying it in any way at all, and it's just, it is what it is, and so everything's very somber, and I mean, obviously there's times where the action is like bumping and the music's bumping, but generally it's very tonally dark, and so I like it a lot. I like stories that take place in this kind of setting, but I could see some people not liking it. But personally, I love it. Yeah, it's a very dark universe where everybody's like either addicted to drugs, violence, or sex in like the most depraved way possible. in order to deal with the fact that they're either poor as dirt or being completely screwed over by a company of some kind. And so it's super tyrannical and pretty much the darkest possible future. And it really hits home. All the points are poignant, and it's just about, well, this show in particular is about a boy named David Martinez, who is just kind of a lost kid in the beginning. He's 17 years old when this show starts, and he's a really talented individual, but he just doesn't fit in with these super preppy people in the Arasaka school. He's not rich. He comes from a broken home where his mother does anything in order to get by, and I think in universe she's an edge runner. Yeah, I think, well, they pretty much specifically say so. But she is an edge runner, so she does illegal activities in order to make money. And so his life is just kind of screwed up, and nobody really likes him or even thinks about him except for his mother, who tragically dies after a group of edge runners hit their car by a accidental shooting. Yeah, she's taken to a legal doctor who then does a really poor job at patching her up, and then says that their insurance doesn't cover the procedure, and so he lets her die, and he then basically has to live by himself. And so the only way he can even make do anymore is by becoming an edge runner or a cyberpunk. And it's really dark and depressing, and it's you really feel for David, because he's just a kid, and yet he no longer has any parents, and he's just trying to make do, and he no longer can. And so his whole life is about essentially not having any control over it, and just the amount of suffering he goes through is quite a lot. And so you get attached to David almost immediately, just because of how tragic his story is. And he's honestly a really nice person. I mean, for the most part, he gets a bit less so later on, but he really cares about his mother in particular, and he just wants to live his life. He just wanted to find his own dreams, but he couldn't manage to do that, and so instead he lives for other people, which is genuinely really tragic, but fits within the universe, and if it's the tone, and if it's like the general atmosphere, it's fantastic. I love it. And so I guess I won't spoil how the plot goes, but needless to say, it's tragic, but it ends relatively well, for at least within the Cyberpunk 2077 universe. Now, the tabletop RPG is a bit lighter in tone, but it's still about corporations ruling the world. It was more about like 80s-esque corporations leading the world. That's why the Japanese in particular were used as the heads of most corporations, because back in the 80s there was this whole boom within the Japanese economy, and so they had to deal with a lot of Japanese companies taking over everything within the 80s, and that's why Cyberpunk 2022, I think, was about that kind of thing, whereas now everything's different, and it's about corporations in general ruling society, and so they focus less on the punk and more on the cyber in this particular iteration. So yeah, no, I loved it. I loved it so much. Overall, I can't recommend the show enough. Now, fair warning, I mean, obviously a lot of sex, a lot of violence, a lot of really dark tones, so if you're not into like a show that's not lighthearted, then I wouldn't recommend it. But for everybody else, I loved it. It's a warning to the future about how terrible a completely corporate run society would be, and just the lack of care about everything except for profits is well and truly evil. Now, that's not to say the profits aren't good. I mean, at least in real life in general, but to put everything to the side in order to make profits, at least to me, and I'm sure to most people, is clearly evil. And so it's about finding what's important in life and either living well or dying well, and about bringing yourself and other people happiness in the end of all things. And it's really beautiful. God, I can't recommend the show enough. It was great. It's 10 episodes, so you can watch it in a single sit through like I did. And yeah, can't recommend it enough. Although, watching Cybersleuth, please, for the love of God, don't put it on English. It's so bad. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.